The text we're diving into today argues something far more insidious.
And honestly, this text completely flipped my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So for everyone listening, we are taking a deep dive into a discourse titled Exploitation and Pseudo Culture, which was produced by the Prout Now Study Circle.
Yes.
And it's rooted in two major frameworks: the philosophy of neo-humanism and PROU, which stands for the Progressive Utilization Theory. What really struck me reading through the source material is how fiercely it rejects that classic thoughts and prayers approach to fixing the world.
Oh, yeah, that is a really fundamental pillar of neo-humanism.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a long history of philosophical and religious traditions claiming that the material world is merely an illusion.
Right. The world is false idea.
Exactly. And so the logic goes, we should only focus on inner spiritual purity.
Yeah.
But this 1982 discourse fiercely criticizes that, calls it a hypocritical mindset.
Because it just lets the bad guys win, basically.
Pretty much. It's often used as this super convenient excuse by the privileged to just let systemic exploitation happen completely unchallenged.
Yeah, totally.
The text argues you cannot achieve what neo-humanism calls the welfare of all if you suffer from the disease of dualism. Where your lofty spiritual ideals are completely detached from your outward actions. If you want a just world, you have to confront real-world material exploitation head-on.
Okay, but to actually dismantle that exploitation, we first have to understand the underlying mechanics, right? Like, how does the trap actually get set?
Right.
The discourse argues that before anyone can be oppressed, we have to look at this fatal flaw in how human beings form groups in the first place. There's a concept introduced here called socio-sentiment.
Yes, socio-sentiment.
I found this totally fascinating, but I want to make sure I really grasp the mechanism. How exactly does the text define this?
So think of socio-sentiment as a really specific vulnerability in human psychology. It's the tendency for people to confine their identity, their empathy, and their loyalty within a very specific limited boundary.
Like a clique.
Exactly. That boundary could be a family, a caste, a geographic community, or a nationality.
Yeah.
And once an individual's identity is locked inside that boundary, a dual reaction happens.
Okay, what kind of reaction?
Well, they blindly praise everything inside their own group, and they instinctively disparage or mistrust literally anyone outside of it.
Oh, wow. The source material actually uses this darkly funny example to illustrate that. It describes a gang of thieves.
Right, the pickpockets.
Yes. One pickpocket watches another pickpocket execute this flawless theft and goes, "Oh, the sleight of hand of that thief is marvelous."
Yeah, they applaud each other because they share the exact same narrow group boundary, the same complex.
But obviously, the person who just had their wallet stolen is not going to appreciate that marvelous skill.
No, definitely not. It perfectly captures the absurdity of it. And the text points out that this psychological blind spot operates across all levels of society. It uses the historical caste system in India to show how deep it goes.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it mentions a smaller caste, the Tenchal Bagdi, who absolutely refuse to physically touch anyone from the dual Bagdi caste because they consider them socially inferior.
Wait, really?
Yeah. But concurrently, the Tenchal Bagdi are complaining bitterly that their entire community is being systematically ruined by the Brahmins, who sit higher up the caste hierarchy.
They're completely blind to the irony. Like, they're oppressing a smaller group using the exact same logic that a larger group is using to oppress them.
Exactly.
When I read that, my mind immediately went to, the dynamics of a high school cafeteria. You have the debate team, who feel intellectually superior, so they mock the marching band.
Right.
Then you have the varsity sports team, who mocks both the debate team and the band.
The human brain just loves cognitive shortcuts. Creating an us versus them dynamic is the easiest way to protect the ego.
Yeah.
But while high school cliques eventually mature and graduate, socio-sentiment scales up to the geopolitical level.
And that is where the analogy gets really dark, because those kids in the cafeteria don't realize they're all suffering from the exact same tribal disease, this desperate psychological need to feel superior to a smaller circle.
Yes.
The text notes that even people who form a massive national group will look down on smaller regional communities, calling them enemies of the state or narrow-minded. They completely forget that nationalism is literally the exact same disease, just drawn with a slightly larger circumference.
And this is a crucial pivot in the discourse, because this tendency isn't just harmless tribalism or immature clique behavior. This psychological disease, this socio-sentiment, is the open wound that exploiters actively look for.
Wow.
Yeah. It's the necessary prerequisite for systemic oppression.
But how so? Because, I mean, having a clique mentality is one thing, but mutating that into centuries of economic and political dominance seems like a massive leap.
It is a massive leap, but it's achieved by weaponizing self-worth.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So when an exploiting group gains even a fraction of power, they solidify that power by injecting what the text calls a fear complex and an inferiority complex into the minds of the oppressed.
Interesting.
The primary goal of an exploiter isn't just to steal resources. It is to make the oppressed group accept their lower status as a natural, unchangeable biological or cultural fact.
The historical examples in the text are just so visceral. It mentions India under British rule, specifically how just 45 or 50 years prior to the discourse being written, there were special train compartments reserved exclusively for people wearing European dress.
Right, yeah.
If you wore traditional Indian clothing, you were barred from entry.
No.
Or how brilliant scholars like people who had spent decades mastering Sanskrit were entirely dismissed as uneducated simply because they didn't speak English.
And that brings us right back to the scenario you brought up at the very beginning of our discussion.
Yeah.
The signboards. The ruling class deliberately prints public signs in their own language in massive bold letters, while the local language is either totally absent or printed in tiny script at the bottom.
Which the text points out teaches the locals that their own tongue is merely a vernacular, which is this highly derogatory term that historically implies the language of slaves or the uncivilized.
Exactly. And the mechanism at play here is what the text calls psychic exploitation. A child grows up seeing those signs, seeing their traditional clothes rejected at the train station, and they internalize a deep-seated inferiority.
It just seeps in.
It does. They subconsciously conclude, the big letters represent the language of the powerful. My language, my culture, and by extension, my very self must be small and inferior.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic here for a moment because this is where I really wrestled with the text.
Go for it.
If a group is being physically robbed, right? If their wealth is being drained and they are starving, won't they just riot? Like, how does psychological conditioning override the biological urge to survive and fight back against economic domination?
That's a fair point.
Surely, at the end of the day, an empire maintains control because they just have more guns, right?
Yeah, that's a very common assumption. But the text makes a vital distinction to answer that exact point. Using armies, guns, and physical coercion is classified as politico-economic exploitation. It's brute force.
Okay.
But manipulating language, dress, and cultural norms to shatter a people's self-esteem, that is psycho-economic exploitation. And the discourse argues that psycho-economic exploitation is infinitely more dangerous because it creates a self-policing society.
So it's the difference between building a physical prison and building a prison inside someone's mind.
Exactly. If you rely solely on brute force, the oppressed group knows they are being oppressed. Their internal identity remains totally intact.
They're just biding their time.
Right. They're simply waiting for the strategic moment when they have enough physical strength to overthrow the oppressor. But if you successfully inject an inferiority complex, the exploited group loses the psychological will to rebel. They begin to police themselves. As the text vividly describes, once this complex is ingrained, even if you catch hold of an oppressed person's hand and cordially invite them to sit at the table with you as an equal, they'll refuse.
Because they don't think they deserve it?
Exactly. They genuinely believe they do not belong there. This psychic exploitation provides the stable foundation required for the economic extraction to continue uninterrupted for centuries.
That is incredibly sobering, because once that mental prison is built, the economic trap just snaps shut. How does the text actually map out the economic mechanics of this exploitation?
Well, the economic model is devastatingly efficient once the psychological resistance is neutralized. The exploited region is forcibly reduced to being a mere supplier of raw materials.
Right.
The ruling class extracts these raw materials at dirt cheap prices, shifts them back to their own territory, manufactures finished products, and then turns around and uses the exploited country as a captive market to sell those finished goods back at a premium.
It's a closed loop of systemic theft. You take their cotton for pennies, and you sell them back the shirt for dollars.
Yeah.
The text makes a brilliant observation here about independence movements, actually. It notes that a country can achieve political independence, they can raise their own flag and elect their own leaders without ever achieving true politico-economic independence.
Yes, and India is used as the prime example there. The masses were inspired to fight for political freedom, and they achieved it.
Right.
But because their deeper consciousness wasn't fully aroused and those psychic inferiority complexes were never fully dismantled, the economic drain just continued. The physical rulers left the building, but the mental chains remained, allowing new forms of economic exploitation to simply replace the old ones.
Which brings up the most frustrating question. Where are the leaders? If the people are trapped in this loop, who is supposed to be pulling the alarm?
Oh, the text has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, this is where the discourse issues a massive warning about the enablers of the status quo. It identifies a few specific actors, starting with what it calls vocal revolutionaries.
Yes, the vocal revolutionaries.
Yeah.
These are the politicians who understand exactly how to manipulate the pain of the masses. They stand on a podium and deliver these fiery, impassioned lectures denouncing social and economic injustice.
I'd say all the right things.
They know all the right buzzwords to get the crowd cheering, but behind closed doors, they are entirely funded by the wealthy exploiters. They're paid to capture the public's anger and channel it into dead-end political theater.
I mean, if you're listening to this and thinking about every modern politician or corporate entity who talks a big game on television about equality, but consistently votes for policies that protect monopolies and corporate bailouts, this 1982 text is describing that exact playbook.
It really is.
But the text argues that there's a group even more insidious than the corrupt politicians, the reformists.
Yes. A reformist is someone who advocates for very slow, gradual patchwork changes. They're the voices saying, we can't rush things, the system is flawed, but let's just make small, pragmatic improvements over time.
The source material provides this brilliant, almost theatrical example of a reformist in action. It describes a leader making a huge public spectacle out of drinking a glass of filtered water that was touched by a lower caste person.
Right, and the crowd goes wild.
Exactly. They applaud and say, what a progressive, brave visionary.
But the text calls this out as fundamental cowardice, because the inner intention of that reformist is to maintain the overarching status quo. If they truly possessed the courage to solve the problem, they wouldn't perform a token gesture for applause. They'd demand the total annihilation of the caste system itself.
Yes.
They would say, the system is the root cause of the discrimination. Let us break the bondage of caste entirely.
It really makes me think of a landlord who realizes a house is structurally compromised by toxic black mold.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Instead of tearing down the drywall and fixing the plumbing, which is expensive and disruptive, the landlord just buys a bucket of cheap white paint and paints right over the mold.
Yeah, just cover it up.
Exactly. It looks clean to the tenants for a few weeks, and the landlord gets to look like they solved the problem. But the reformist landlord has actually endangered the tenants further because the mold is still growing in the walls, and now the tenants think they're safe.
That's spot on.
The text argues that reformists do enormous harm to humanity by pacifying the public and delaying the revolutionary surgery that is actually required.
That's a perfect encapsulation of the danger. Reformists are motivated by a fear complex. They're terrified of the chaos of real change, or by a cunning desire to protect their own comfortable position within the existing hierarchy.
Makes total sense.
And we also have to look at the religious enablers mentioned in the discourse.
Right, the creation of what the text calls satellite groups.
Yes. Religious leaders often use dogma to build these satellite groups for their wealthy backers. They utilize the ultimate fear complex, telling their followers, do not question the social order. I am speaking with the voice of heaven. If you challenge this hierarchy, your tongue will fall off or you will burn in hellfire. Wow. It deliberately paralyzes the critical thinking faculties of the masses. It turns them into docile, obedient workers for the affluent groups waiting in the shadows to exploit their labor.
So let's look at the board here. You have the initial vulnerability of socio-sentiment, which exploiters weaponize into an inferiority complex.
Right.
That mental prison allows the economic trap to extract wealth continuously. And when the people look for a way out, they're betrayed by corrupt politicians, pacified by mold-painting reformists, and terrified by dogmatic religious leaders.
It's a completely comprehensive system of control.
But even with reformists painting over the mold, eventually people start coughing.
Right.
They start feeling the economic squeeze. Hunger and poverty are incredibly powerful motivators. So how does the exploiting class prevent a mass awakening? How do they stop the people from eventually seeing through the theater and organizing?
They deploy the final and perhaps most devastating weapon, cultural exploitation, specifically through the imposition of pseudo-culture.
Okay, to understand how this weapon works, we have to establish what culture actually is first. The discourse defines culture beautifully as the subtler and sweeter expressions of human life.
It's art, philosophy, literature, and critical thought. It's the elevation of the human mind beyond mere survival.
But the trap lies in how the mind processes information. The text argues that a wealthy, exploiting group will actively flood the oppressed group's society with vulgar, low-quality entertainment.
Right.
It gives the examples of imposing cheap, base cinemas, dramas, and art onto communities that might have a profound cultural heritage but lack the financial power to mass-produce their own media. Let's dig into the actual mechanism here, because this is where the psychology gets really fascinating. Why does watching a trashy movie stop you from protesting for fair wages?
Well, the text points out that the human mind naturally tends to flow downwards. It is biologically much easier to consume something base, shocking, and vulgar than it is to engage with something subtle and intellectually demanding.
It comes down to cognitive load and cheap dopamine.
Precisely. Engaging with high culture, grappling with philosophy, analyzing political structures, organizing a community response requires massive amounts of executive function and mental energy.
Definitely.
But consuming pseudoculture requires zero effort. It provides an immediate, numbing dopamine hit. If a wealthy class can keep a population constantly distracted and exhausted by a relentless diet of low-tier entertainment, they effectively strip that population of the mental bandwidth required for critical thinking.
It's a deliberate pacification strategy. The metaphor used in the text is incredibly stark. It states that pseudoculture breaks a society's spine.
Yes, a spineless society.
If your cultural backbone is broken by this constant drip of cheap dopamine, you become a spineless society. And a spineless, mentally exhausted population will never be able to stand united, organize, and raise their heads in protest against political or economic exploitation.
And this completely shifts how we have to view the modern media ecosystem. Resisting pseudoculture isn't about being an elitist or a cultural snob who only listens to classical music.
Right. It's not about being pretentious.
Not at all. It's a matter of psychological survival. Maintaining a high standard of culture is about keeping your psychological spine intact. The text offers a really dire warning. You can struggle all you want for political freedom. You can march in the streets for social emancipation. But if your cultural backbone has been broken by pseudoculture, all those struggles will ultimately fail.
Man,
The discourse compares it to pouring ghee into a fire that has already died out.
that blew my mind. Choosing to engage with art, media, and ideas that challenge and elevate you, rather than media that degrades and numbs you, is actually a concrete revolutionary act.
It absolutely is.
It's how you build the mental endurance required to fight for justice.
Which brings us to the ultimate mission of this discourse. It doesn't just diagnose the mechanisms of oppression, it provides the philosophical framework for liberation.
Let's trace the path we've walked today. Exploitation begins with the tribal disease of socio-sentiment. Exploiters pry that vulnerability open to inject psychic inferiority complexes, making us subconsciously believe we deserve our lower status.
Yeah.
This mental conditioning paves the way for the psychoeconomic trap, turning populations into captive markets for their own stolen resources. We're kept docile by fake reformists who offer cosmetic paint jobs instead of structural cures.
And our ultimate will to fight is neutralized by a numbing diet of spineless pseudoculture.
But the antidote is active, aroused consciousness. The text insists that to liberate society from this unendurable cycle, we have to engage in deep study. We must relentlessly question the what, the why, and the how of our social structures.
Exactly. We have to shatter the illusions of religious and political dogma using a liberated, fiercely independent intellect.
And this is the core of neo-humanism and the progressive utilization theory. It's a wildly progressive, optimistic framework. It demands that we stop accepting the world as it's presented to us by those in power.
It asks us to fight against these psychic traps, to build a world of actual happiness, dignity, and justice for every human being, not just the people inside our own little socio-sentiment cliques.
And honestly, to make this world a better place for all to live with happiness and justice, the source material really points to knowing more about neo-humanism and PROU.
Yes, it envisions a new ethics for future humanity rooted in scientific spirituality. It's the recognition that freedom isn't just the absence of physical chains, it's the total eradication of psychic and economic exploitation.
If you're listening to this and you feel that spark of realization, if you're tired of the reformist paint jobs and want to address the root structural rot, There are concrete ways to arm yourself intellectually. Engaging with these theories, seeking out the original texts, and studying the historical patterns we discussed today is how you begin to build that intellectual spine. Understanding the precise mechanisms of how the matrix operates is the very first step to unplugging from it.
Reclaiming your mind from pseudoculture is how you eventually reclaim your society.
And for anyone who wants to firm up their understanding of this scientific spirituality and neo-humanism, you can actually join the Prout Study Circle. Check out their YouTube channels like @Sedvipris Movement or @New Human Project.
It's all about finding that authenticity.
Yeah. And for the original knowledge, you can visit Ananda Marga Publication or email ampsbooks@gmail.all.or. As we wrap up this deep dive, though, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on.
Let's hear it.
We started by exploring how easy it is to look at a broken world and assume it's just a matter of who has the most money and the biggest guns. But now you know the silent psychological weapons at play. So I want you to evaluate your media diet over the last week.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Right. Look at the news you consumed, the social media feeds you scrolled through, the entertainment you binged. Look at it really closely. Was that media challenging you, building up your cultural spine and helping you stand tall? Or was it pseudoculture, slowly and quietly training you to keep your head down?
In a world built on psychic exploitation, that is a question worth asking yourself every single day.
Keep your spine straight, keep your mind sharp, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.